Thanks for tuning in again, everybody. We're back with your favorite podcast, Luca's Tigers and Bronze. Oh my.
Cage is a big wrestling fan. Eric and I, we met through Gary Vee, in theory.
Yeah.
We met through Empathy Wines. So when I was
Nice.
selling Empathy Wines, I reached out to them. They supported. And Eric's wife, Lori, she runs a podcast as well. And they came to the city. So I treated them to a bottle of wine and they got to see the office. So that's how we met.
Sweet. So listen, Eric, we are a sports card podcast, but we talk about a whole bunch of other stuff. But more importantly, what I would say is, you got an amazing story. But before we jump into this and actually record it, is there anything you want to get out there? Is there any business you're working on now, a podcast, something for your wife's podcast, anything you want to talk about? Because if there is, we'll lead with that. And, we can just, let this be a platform for you. Maybe grab a few more listeners for your wife's podcast or whatever you might be doing now. We want you to get something out of this, my friend.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Really, I've got a lot of things going on, but I think the only thing that I would want to promote is obviously my podcast, which is called 83 Weeks with Eric Bischoff. And I'm also involved in a pretty highly successful Patreon platform called adfreeshows.com. We just found out the other day that we were the 56th highest revenue generating platform on Patreon. So that's kind of a big damn deal.
That's for the podcast, or it's a separate thing that you're doing on
Well,
Patreon?
adfreeshows.com is a separate platform that's got not only all of the podcasts, we have 6 different podcasts within our network, all wrestling related. Myself, Bruce Pritchard, Arnie Anderson, Jim Ross, Tony Schiavone, and now Kurt Angle.
Nice.
So
awesome.
6 days out of the week, we're dropping a fresh wrestling related podcast with 6 different people.
He's got a horseman. He's got an Olympian. He's got executives. You got it all covered, every angle, man.
We got everything. But you just set me up. I'll promote it. We can go from there.
Beautiful. All right, man. Unless you have anything else, Andrew, we can roll right into this and let you do your Walter Cronkite bit.
Luca Nation. Today's guest is someone that's very near and dear to my heart. He is a virtual mentor of sorts. And he's someone who's worked directly with Vince McMahon. He's produced WWE classics like SmackDown and Raw. And you're an actor, producer, and businessman. For all you wrestling fans out there, you're going to nerd out to this episode. I know Cage already has. When I told him we're going to have Eric Bischoff on today's episode, he said, "What? I watched that guy wrestle.
Yeah.
That's amazing." Eric is an amazing creator, producer, actor, storyteller, and I highly recommend right now, just pause this episode and go subscribe to 83 Weeks with Eric Bischoff. That's his podcast where he also tells stories, tells a whole variety of things. So go ahead, pause, subscribe. And with that, Eric, I want to welcome you to the Luca Nation show. But I have a question for you. You were in contention to buy WCW at one point. Is that true? Can you tell us the story about that?
I sure can, Andrew. Thank you, and Cage, for having me on the show. I've been looking forward to this. It's kind of a long, sordid story that really, from beginning and middle and end, would probably be about an 18-month story. But I'll bring you in towards the very end of Act 3, in the essence of time and not boring your listeners. At one point, because of AOL and Time Warner and Turner Broadcasting were merging, it was kind of a colossal mess, probably one of the worst mergers in American history. Most MBAs will tell you, and things were really falling apart, particularly for WCW, because that brand, WCW, the wrestling entity within Turner Broadcasting, was not a favorite amongst a lot of the key executives in Turner, but especially some of the key executives at AOL and Time Warner. So long story short, things were falling apart. I actually went to the president of TNT Network, a guy by the name of Brad Siegel, and said, "Brad, if things keep going the way they're going, there won't be anything left for you to sell. Why don't you let me try to find a buyer while it still has value, WCW?" He kind of laughed me out of his office and said, "Yeah, sure. If you think you can find somebody, go ahead." And I came back about a month later with a gentleman by the name of Brian Badal and Steve Greenberg, both of whom had created a company called, I don't know what the name of the company was when they did it, but they created the Sports Classic Network, which was subsequently sold to ESPN as ESPN Classic Sports. Did the same thing with a lot of collegiate programming and sold that to CBS. Very astute guys. Anyway, fast forward, we raised $67 million. We went to Turner Broadcasting with an offer. There was an agreement to purchase. We signed a letter of intent, went into due diligence, and probably a week or two before the deal was supposed to close, Jamie Kellner from Warner Entertainment or Warner Brothers came over to run all of Turner and immediately killed that deal. And that, as they say, is the last of that story.
That sounds like
so they pulled it off the air, right? I mean, they pulled it off the air, right? They said there's not going to be a home for it on TV anymore. So they basically said, why would we buy this, right? If they're not going to air it, right?
Right. Well, a big, the $67 million price tag, and I think it was actually 81, might have been the total price, but whatever it was, $80 million price tag included a commitment to air WCW. So in other words, it was a purchase / television licensing agreement. And when Kellner came in, he pulled out the licensing agreement, part of it for television, which means we didn't have a home, which means we were dead in the water.
Right. It doesn't have the value anymore. And ultimately, right. I think the cherry on top of this story is with no TV home, I think that the licensing, the agreements, the library, the classics, the everything of WCW ultimately was bought for $3.5 million by WWF and Vince McMahon's company. This way they had all that stuff as part of their library. $3.5 million.
Yeah.
We know of baseball cards that are selling for more than that now.
Well, I'm going to talk to you guys about collectible cards because I heard something the other day that got my attention about my cards.
Yeah. Well, jump right into it. Go ahead. I mean, that's it. I mean, it's a great segue. Go for it. What do you want to know? Let's chat.
So, series of coincidences. I ended up on a road trip. Mostly, my wife and I have our son and daughter-in-law live in Tampa, Florida. So we travel with our dog. Didn't want to fly, so we decided, let's take a road trip. So on our road trip, down to Tampa, Florida from Cody, Wyoming, which is in the middle of freaking nowhere, we stopped in Huntsville to visit some friends and a business partner of mine. And along the way, I got all these books that I've been, my book came out in 2007, I think, and I bought up a bunch of them to use for giveaways and things like that, autograph stuff. And we just had so many of them left and I wanted to get rid of them. So I called my business partner and I said, hey, can you use these books as some sort of premium? I'll give them to you. I just wanted them out of my house. Boom, get down there. And when I went out to my guest house to unload all these books out of one of the spare rooms, I noticed there was a couple boxes of trading cards of me. And they were a first run. I can't remember the name of the company that did it right now off the top of my head, but they were brand new in the box. And I also have there were like 4 metal plates that were used to print these cards. They're like 4 different colors. So I brought them down with me and my business partner says, hey, do you know that this stuff's worth money? Said, get the hell out of here. They're worth anything. He goes, let me check around. So they're investigating their worth, but the numbers I'm hearing now are somewhere around $1,500 autograph. So I'm hoping.
It wouldn't surprise me. I'd be curious what it is. Do you remember when, because you've had deals with different cards, right? I mean, you've been in Leaf cards, you've been in, for WWF, you've been in, WWE ones, you've been in WCW ones. You've had cards that go back, I've seen ones with, with your son, you're on dual cards, back in 2012. I mean, I've seen all kinds of stuff.
Hey,
I'd be curious.
Eric has a Topps card too.
Yeah, he's got Topps cards.
2017. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, these were WWF cards, and I think they were the WWF Legends edition.
Yep.
But they're all down in Huntsville now, and they're taking them over. I guess there's some guy that's in this business and he certifies them to a certain degree depending on their condition and authenticates them, puts them in a little plastic case, and I signed them all, so they're going to put a valuation on them. So I'm just sitting here deciding how I'm going to spend my $40 or my $200,000.
I hope it's $200,000. Wait, I'm getting another call. Is it David Peck? No, Peck, you can't buy these cards. I'm sorry, man. I'm sorry. We're gonna have to see what they are. So we have one crazy wrestling card guy, and he's gonna love that story. And I'm sure when he hears this, he's one of our first guests, if not our first guest on the show. When he hears this, he's gonna start messaging you and saying, "Let me see pictures. I'll buy them all from you." Wait, because I mean, he posts stuff. he messaged Harley Race directly and bought cards directly from the King. So there's definitely a market for your stuff out there, 100%. And that when you have their first run with the printing plates for it, that's a cool thing, because that's like a complete like collectible. So that's pretty sweet.
Yeah, we'll find out. Like I said, it's either going to be a sushi bar tab or a trip to, I don't know, New Zealand, maybe.
So I'm going to make a statement here, right? And then, Andrew, I'll turn it back over to you, right? I'm going to make a statement just for the folks listening, because I watched wrestling as a kid, and I watched it when I was a little older, because wrestling was cool. I'm going to make a statement, and I'm going to say this. I'm going to say that Vince McMahon and the WWE and the show that they put on today with the wrestling superstars and you name it, would not be as big and would not be the show that it is today if not for you. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, well, I'm not necessarily an impartial, objective individual in this conversation.
So let me say why, right? And then you tell me where I'm wrong, right? I think you forced them to react. I think you forced them to change the way that they put on a show. And I think that you, with WCW, with the NWO, with what you did with WCW, and might I add, the Monday Night Wars, it was a stroke of genius. And for, I think it was 84 straight weeks, you knocked them off the top of the chart. And they had to be scrambling like crazy in ratings. You also, unless I'm wrong, you upped the amount of pay-per-views that wrestling had. I mean, wrestling pay-per-views were not a huge thing. And you had like once a month. I mean, you were doing UFC style, I mean, a lot of people took their cues from the successes that you had in WCW. I could be wrong, but that's my version of history.
Yeah, no, and I try to be really objective when it comes to this kind of conversation, but I'm clearly not. I lived through it, right? So no matter how hard I try. But look, if anybody that was being balanced and objective wanted to kind of analyze what really happened, from the late 90s, really go into the early 90s to 2000s, take that 10-year window.
Yep.
The WWE in the late 80s came on really strong, changed the business model, changed the presentation of the product, ended up on national television, took pay-per-view to a level that it had never been before. There were so many firsts that many people look back at that and say, that was the golden era in many respects of professional wrestling, at least that era, that generation. But if you're honest about it and you look at the early 90s, the WWF revenue stream was in popularity was gradually deteriorating.
Yep.
It started out hot. It was a new thing. It was kind of a fad. It was cool. It was pop culture, but a portion of the audience, after they kind of tuned in for a little while, grew out of it, is basically what happens. And wrestling was getting pretty flat. Now, right about the same time that the numbers were deteriorating and popularity was declining, Vince McMahon found himself in the middle of a really, really high-profile steroid trial.
Yep.
Which really battered the product because there was so much other stuff going on people were focused on. It certainly battered and hurt the brand and the relationship with advertisers and program directors and general managers and things like that, people that you need to be in business with. And the numbers really started to slide into the mid-90s, 93, 94. And also during that time, the WWE product, it was then WWF, was really geared towards kids 2 to 11. If you go back during that era and you look at their characters, they were like, a psychotic garbage man and a creepy dentist and a super mean IRS agent and a midget, a giant clown. There was just, everybody was like an over the top human cartoon.
Yep. I remember the dentist.
Yeah, Isaac Yankem.
You know what else I remember? I remember because obviously WWF is on a downslope. I remember 1994, right? I'm a teenager, and I remember going with my family to maybe 1995. I remember going with my family to Disney MGM Studios. It's called Hollywood Studios now, and they did a backlot tour. And on the backlot tour, there was a prop. It was like a boat, and the boat was from a movie called Thunder in Paradise. Right?
Yeah.
And that was a movie wrestling fans know about. That was a movie that was starring Hulk Hogan at the time, right?
It was actually a television series.
Yeah, see, a television series, and there's this boat, this Thunder in Paradise with Hulk Hogan in it. Little did I know, as I'm on this back scene tour, that the face of wrestling in the mid '90s and for the rest of the decade was being changed in Florida. As that show was being filmed, there's a guy by the name of Eric Bischoff, maybe you heard of him, who moves the production of his wrestling company down to Florida. And tell me about how you were able to convince what was the biggest star for a decade in the WWF to come and join you.
All right. And I'm just going to wrap up and kind of finish my thought about changing the wrestling business. Along came Nitro. Along came my approach to Nitro. I created a 2-hour live format, weekly format, never been done before. I started putting main event level matches on television for free, never been done before. I targeted, instead of kids 2 to 11 like WWF, I targeted 18 to 34 and 18 to 49-year-old males, changed up the presentation completely, added a lot more reality to it. And in the end, what happened was the WWF, to your point earlier, was forced to change their business model. Then came the Monday Night Wars. Then came an unprecedented level of television viewers for professional wrestling throughout the 90s, probably in the area of about 8 to 10 million people a week on a Monday night watching wrestling. And it was that war. It was the manifestation of all of those things that we did when we launched this new format that forced WWE to change. All tides, all boats rise with a high tide, and the tide has never been higher. WWE was able to go public on that success, and that's why you're seeing the WWE that you're seeing today. Had they stayed on the path that they were on before I launched Nitro, they likely would not be, it wouldn't be the company you see today. Now let's go back to Disney.
We could do the Disney, and then I'm going to come back to the Monday Night Wars and how they changed and the talent that was brought in, I think, because of you, in response to what you were doing after you brought in Hogan and what we did with the NWO. So, yeah, talk to me about Disney. You decide to move the company down to Florida. You're going to do filming down there at the same time, coincidentally, that a guy named Hulk Hogan, Terry, he's down there and he's filming his TV show. Talk to me about that. You just walk into a bar and say, "Oh, fancy meeting you here."
Now, I mean, the two things kind of happened independent of each other. Obviously, the Thunder in Paradise television series was being produced in Orlando because Hulk didn't want to go to LA. He doesn't like California. He doesn't like traveling. So it was like, great, I'll be in your television series, but you have to produce it here. So the producers, who were the producers of Baywatch, by the way, chose to produce that show at the Disney MGM lot, at least the interior stuff. I coincidentally had moved WCW production down to Disney at about the same time. And I sat down with it, to answer your question earlier, I sat down with about 8 or 10 Disney executives from various parts of the corporation and presented my idea to bring wrestling to the Disney MGM studios as a theme park attraction. From my end, what I got out of it was a much more controlled production environment that allowed me to really elevate the production values of the show, which it needed badly. I was able to, just through, economies of scale, reduce our expenses of production. It came with some real challenges, but I was able to do it. So there was a lot of reasons. Anyway, we got down there and Hogan happened to be there. I was on a little bit of a roll business-wise, and we had some mutual friends in close proximity. So we exchanged phone numbers and Hulk ended up calling me and we went from there.
You're on mute, Cage. But you know what's interesting to me? I come from an athlete background. Eric, you know this. But what's interesting to me is wrestling has the components of a professional sport, but it also has the components of production, movies. And I'm wondering, can you give us like a behind the scenes of what a day in the life looks like of The Rock or Hulk Hogan? How do they prepare? Are they working out in the mornings and training? And then you're doing readings and prepping and lines in the afternoon. What's a day in the life look like?
Well, I can't speak to Rock. I've never worked really with him more than a couple small scenes, and I've not worked in WWE while he was there. But I can tell you, in a general sense, most talent, especially the stars of the show, the John Cena's or Undertaker's or Drew McIntyre's, Roman Reigns, whoever is considered to be the top of the roster. You get to the building. Usually most guys don't work out in the morning. Some do. Most guys don't. They often work out at night after they're done, sometimes during the day, but typically they get to the building about 11 o'clock. And they would have already seen rough drafts of the scripts and all the things that they're going to be doing in that particular day. That would have gotten to them usually by Friday or Saturday at the latest. So on Monday, for example, when they get to the building, they already have a pretty good idea what they're doing and have been able to think about it. Get to the building about 11 o'clock. Usually it's an early lunch. Then the agents, the individuals who they're really producers is what they are. They used to be called agents in wrestling, but they're producers. Their producers take everybody, their individual scripts and storylines and interviews and all that, and start walking through it, blocking it, scheduling it, for different parts of the day and locations and so forth. That process usually runs up until about 5 o'clock, producing all of those backstage interviews and things like that. That process usually goes to about 5 o'clock. During that same time, if the talent is wrestling, if they've got a match, they're also, while they're doing all their other things, are starting to lay out their match, if they hadn't already done so over the weekend, starting to figure out, okay, how are we going to tell the story in the ring on a very granular basis? And usually that's hopefully, barring any changes and things like that occur, everybody's pretty much ready to go by 7 o'clock, and boom, on go the lights and off goes the show.
In every good story, there's a hero and a villain. Do you like playing the villain or the hero more?
Oh, I was born to be the villain.
That's it. I said heel turn to Andrew the other day, and he's like, "What's that? What's a heel turn?" It's a perfect
antagonist.
segue. Yeah, it's a perfect
segue. Antagonist. A babyface is a protagonist.
So, Andrew, I'm going to tell you something, and Eric's got to finish drinking his coffee because I don't want him spitting it out. But one of my favorite things, so he was an announcer on Nitro, right? As it progressed, and the Monday Night Wars. One of the coolest things was, Monday he had Nitro, and the WWF had their show Monday Night Raw. Now, looking back, if you're one of the WWF people, I don't know how they allowed themselves to do this, but one of the coolest things was they both had good talent, but Nitro was live and Raw was not always live, right? So you want to talk about ratings awesomeness, right? You have Eric sitting there doing the announcing, doing an announcer on Nitro, and they would spoil the results of Raw because the matches would be done, but they wouldn't be aired yet. So they weren't airing them live. So you could tune into Nitro and not only watch their wrestling matches, but also find out what happened in Raw. And I'm like, this is genius. I mean, whose idea was that, man?
That was mine.
There you go. I remember watching that. I'm like, oh man, the people at WWF, they gotta be so pissed.
Well, here's the thing though, but that was one of the things that helped Nitro become very successful right out of the gate. Look, when the idea of Nitro, it wasn't my idea. It was Ted Turner's idea. I was in a meeting with Ted Turner talking about, distributing our content over in China, which was the reason I was in the meeting with Ted. And right in the middle of a conversation, he stopped it and said, "Eric, what do we need to do to be competitive with the WWF?" I said, "Well, Ted, they're on prime time during the week. We're not. We're on Saturday night at 6:05 Eastern on TBS, which means we're on at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the West Coast. Nobody's watching wrestling or anything else at that time." He said, "Great. You've got 2 hours every night on prime time. Go head to head." Then I had to think about, okay, now what do I do? I didn't expect that. And I knew immediately, I left Ted's office. I walked across the CNN Center atrium, got to my office, locked myself in my office, sat there with a legal yellow pad and said, okay, I can't be better than the WWF at what they're doing. It's impossible. They're too good at it. They've been doing it too long. The only way I'm not going to fail is if I'm different than the WWF. I knew I couldn't be better than them at what they did, but I knew I could be different than them. And I focused everything I could do to be as different from my competition as I could be while still being wrestling. And one of the first things I said is, all right, I'm going to break all the rules, because there's a lot of rules.
A lot of rules. Yep.
A lot of cultural things, and I thought, okay, I'm going to do something nobody would ever do. I'm going to give away the results of my competition show. And all the people around me said, "Oh my God, you can't do that." I said, "Who says who? It's not a law. You guys have just all agreed to this for some reason. I don't agree with it, so I'm going to do it. I can't go to jail. The FCC is not going to find me, so I'm going to do it." Well, I did it the first night, and the controversy it created, because the audience now, not just the wrestling talent and executives in both companies, but wrestling fans were I was the Antichrist for breaking this whatever traditional kind of under the table handshake everybody supposedly had. I went, nah, I'm not doing that. And it was that controversy that caused people to tune in such big numbers so immediately. And then I went, okay, well, this works pretty good. I'm going to keep doing things that nobody would ever expect to do and keep making as much noise as I possibly can.
Yeah, I mean, it just changed the whole thing, right? And that led right into, so I watched as a young kid, and there's always been storylines, right? There's always been the off the mat, behind the scenes, but it was always, dare I say the word, silly, right? You had Jake the Snake with his snake pit. You had Roddy Piper's pit. You had Brutus the Barber Beefcake, where he was shaving people's heads. You had Uncle Elmer's wedding, I mean, you had Hillbilly Jim. You had the Iron Sheik.
Anyone talk about Scotty Too Hottie anymore? Is he in play?
Yeah, he's in play. He's on play for you. You'll find them on Grindr, Andrew. No, but here's the fun part, right? So you have all these fun plays, right? You have all these, crazy Nikolai Volkov and Iron Sheik teaming up, but it was all campy. It was all very campy.
I mean, that's what I was saying earlier, Cage. You're talking about late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah.
By the time 96 came around, we introduced the NWO.
That's where I was going. You went right where I was going. That changed it, right? That changed everything. You brought in Nash and Hall, and go ahead, talk about that, man. How did that happen? And that is a huge, momentous. That is, I think, it changed. What you see in wrestling right now is because of what you did there.
I agree, and because they had to follow suit. When I talked earlier about, looking at that list of things that I had to do differently, I knew I couldn't compete with the WWF for a kids 2 to 11 demographic because they were already there and had been there for a long time. I went to the 18 to 49-year-old demo, and that's why you saw the NWO in the way it was presented. It was not presented for kids. It was presented for an 18 to 49-year-old audience. And in order to appeal to that demo, I had to make the product more believable, more reality-based, as opposed to the storylines and the characters you were referring to later or earlier.
Yep.
So that was the shift. And it took WWE or WWF almost 1.5 years or 2 years to go, okay, we can't do what we're doing anymore. We have to do what those guys are doing.
Right. So, I mean, you brought on the WWF, the Attitude Era, right? But, before that, right? So how do you convince Hogan, who is, I am a real American? How do you convince him to shoe polish up blonde? And how do you convince him to go heel? How do you convince him to join the NWO and be a bad guy? I mean, I didn't have to convince him. He had to convince me. Oh, wow.
Let me tell you the story on that one.
Please.
I'll try to keep these short. A year before the NWO, I went to Hulk's house down in Florida because I felt like in order for him to continue growing as a character, he had to turn heel. And I went down, and at that time I had my own plane, so I flew myself down there. I love to fly. It was an excuse, really. And I flew down. I lived in Atlanta at the time. Got to Hulk's house, big, beautiful 12,000 square foot house, in Bel Air, Florida. And sat down and we were having a beer, and I said, Hulk, this is what I think you need to do. And I think you need to turn heel. And all the time he's stroking his Fu Manchu. If you've never met Hulk, or if you've never, done business with him, whenever he starts hearing something he doesn't like, you get this. Like he's thinking. He's not really thinking. He's thinking about how he's going to ask you.
I was going to tell you no.
But got through my pitch, and he said, Eric, it's 3:00. I got to go pick up my kids at school. Thanks a lot for coming down. And by the way, you'll never understand this character until you've walked a mile in my red and yellow boots. Have a good flight home. It was the nicest I'd ever been thrown out of anybody's house in my life. So I said, okay, great. He doesn't want to turn heel, so he'll just remain this baby face. At around 90, now this was in 95. So in 96, Hulk was off doing a movie. He was only scheduled to do like 4 or 5 appearances for us throughout the year. So during some of his downtime, he was out making a movie in California. Well, this was about the same time that Scott Hall came down, right? So you don't know why I'm here. Next week, I'm bringing my big buddy.
Yep.
A week later, it was who's going to be the third man. There's all this drama and story building up. Hulk's watching this in California.
Yep. And Andrew, before he goes on about this, about bringing Hogan in, you know, I don't want to gloss over this too much. This was like the genesis of the real like wrestling as a drama, right? So Eric brought in Hall and Nash, it was Razor Ramon and Diesel. They were the outsiders, but he brought them in with this intricate story being weaved about how they were WWF guys who were like rebels from the WWF, who were like still sort of WWF, but not really there. And they were coming in to like, you know, kind of take over and take on the WCW. And you had to be careful. I don't know if you had lawyers involved in this too. I mean, I am one myself, but you know, you had to basically make it clear that they didn't work for the WWF, but still trying to stay in character, that they were like defectors almost, right?
Yeah, well, the storyline, and again, we can bore a lot of your audience if I go into
no way, man. This is awesome.
Here, but well, I mean, it's awesome for you. I'm not sure everybody else.
Nah, they're gonna love it.
Much of a wrestling fan as you are.
What's surprising is how many people are wrestling fans in our audience. Like I'm just thinking of Zan Morning and David Peck. We mentioned we have a lot of wrestling fans in our audience, Eric. So I don't think they're going to be bored at all.
All right. Well, the backstory on the NWO, and people don't realize this, some people do, but Scott Hall and Kevin Nash had both worked previously for WCW before they had ever worked in WWF. So they left WCW, they went to work for WWF, became big stars, and were miserable in real life. They wanted to come back. So when they came back, they wanted to come back, I want to go, this is going to be the perfect storyline. So the premise of the NWO storyline was Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, didn't like the way they were treated in WCW, didn't think they were given the opportunities they deserved. So they left. They went on to become big stars. And once they made all their money and became big stars, they were coming back to WCW to take revenge on the people that didn't give them the opportunity they deserved. That was the premise of their story. Well, it worked. And like I said, going back to Hulk saw what was going on. He called me. He said, brother, I can't leave. I'm on the set. Can you fly out to LA? I want to talk to you. I said, sure. Flew out to LA, got to his trailer at about 11 o'clock at night, sat down. There was a big case of Cuban cigars and a lot of beer. And he sat down, he said, okay, so who's the third man going to be? I didn't want to tell him. I want to keep it a secret. I said, well, I don't know, Hulk. Who do you think it should be? He said, you're looking at him, brother. I went, oh, okay. Want to turn heel now. Oh, good idea, Hulk. Good idea. I'm glad you thought of that.
It's amazing. Amazing. That's good. Well, listen, I mean, that changed it, man. For a while there, you had them on the ropes, right? You know, I mean, you were the top dog.
For a period of about 2 years. I mean, there was a point where, you know, and I'm friends with it. You know, I worked for the WWE. I worked for Vince McMahon as a talent, on-camera talent from 2002 to 2006 or 7. I went back for a brief period of time when I met Andrew the first time, and I was living in Stamford, Connecticut, and I was working with Vince McMahon almost every day for the WWE. That was just a year and a half ago. So I'm very friendly with them. I'm doing more work for them in March. But at the same time, I'm sorry, what was the question?
No, that you had him on the ropes, and you said.
Oh, we had him on the ropes. So I have friends of mine that I've made over the years, having worked there, who, you know, confided in me that during that period of time, 95, 96, 97, part of 98, they literally were taking the water coolers out of the office buildings because they couldn't afford to have them serviced.
Wow.
That's how close WWE came to not becoming WWE as we know it.
And they saw your formula for it, right? And I mean, you know, obviously the NWO, you know, takeover was huge. You got to play.
And then came along the Attitude Era. You know?
Yeah, well, you got to play Easy E, or should I call you Sleazy E? Well, it was a fun
I
one.
love them both. I love them both. I'll answer to anything.
And then, but Andrew, just so we can finish this, and then we'll get into the whole. I got a couple fun questions for Eric because he's got some interesting takes on steroids and that kind of stuff too. We can talk about that, but basically that era, what we just talked about, that NWO era, where the Outsiders, Hall Nash, the heel turn of Hogan, that brought about names like Stone Cold Steve Austin, Mick Foley, The Rock. It brought Vince McMahon out. John Cena, thanks, my son. Those are the guys that were the Attitude Era, and it brought Vince McMahon actually out to become his own character, right? I mean, this basically turned the WWF into, I believe, what it is today. And I mean, I'm glad that you're in the fold. I'm glad you're doing work for him because it took your legal pad and whatever you were drinking in your office to kind of change the game a little bit, to sit down, write down, okay, I got to switch it up. I got to do this differently. And wrestling, when I watched in the 80s, it was for kids like me. It was for that 2 to 11, right? It was, hey, eat your veggies, Hulkamaniacs. It was, but that's not what it is now. Now it's a full-on entertainment company for adults.
It is very much so. I gotta adjust my light here. Whoops.
Eric, I'm curious, before we get into Cage's questions, if we could just do a trip down memory lane, how did you get into this line of work?
Sheer coincidence. Years ago, I spent a long time in martial arts. I got my black belt in '79, and then I competed on the amateur kickboxing tournament or circuit, and then turned pro for a couple fights. And during that period of time, I was in my late 20s, I think mid 20s. And I met a Japanese guy by the name of Sonny Ono, who became and still is one of my closest friends. About my same age. One night we were out after competing at a bar somewhere, having a couple beers. We were talking about what we each used to do as kids. He growing up in Tokyo, me growing up in Detroit, how we entertained ourselves because we came from similar families and finances, didn't have any money, had to find ways to have fun. Long story short, we sat there, and by the end of the night, we created this game called Ninja Star Wars. And we went out and had 5,000 of them produced over in South Korea, got them back, couldn't figure out how to sell them. So I went to a guy by the name of Vern Gagne, who had a wrestling promotion in the Midwest, Minneapolis, called AWA. He had a show on ESPN Monday through Friday. And I figured, you know what, if I can get him to air a commercial for my product, on a per inquiry or direct response, basically, I'll split the profits with him and see what happens. So I went in and I pitched him the idea. He loved the idea. It worked pretty well, but he hired me and gave me a job selling syndication for his company, because not only did he have a show on ESPN, he was in about 135 or 140 different television markets in syndication. So I guess because he dug my hustle, he hired me to represent his product in television. And that's how I got in the wrestling business.
That's amazing. And what was the teenage Eric like? Were you studious? Were you a straight A student? Were you rebellious? I'm teeing you up. I'm putting you on the ropes.
No, I was a borderline average student throughout most of elementary and junior high school. I struggled a lot. I was bored a lot. There were things I liked. I loved history, for example. But a lot of stuff I just got bored so quickly. And I just kind of struggled through junior high school. By the time I got to high school, I had worked all my life. I started working when I was like 6 years old. It was my first legitimate job. Well, I don't know how legitimate it was. It was called child labor, but everybody agreed. It was mutual consent. But I've always worked. And by the time I got to high school and had a set of wheels, I was working 2 part-time jobs while I was in high school, until wrestling season came along, because I used to love to wrestle. And if I didn't show up for school, then I couldn't be on the team. So for about, 2 months out of the year, I'd show up and do what I had to do. And the rest of the time I wasn't even there. It's amazing I even graduated from high school because I never went. But that was back in the 70s. It was still kind of the end of the hippie thing, and nobody wanted to fail anybody. So they just, as long as I didn't commit any felonies, they let me graduate.
I read you love Grateful Dead and Fish. How do you feel about John Mayer being on Grateful Dead now? Do you still listen to them?
Dude, where did you read that?
Wikipedia.
Come on now, you know what they say about Wikipedia. I have nothing against Grateful Dead. I just, if you go through the 247 songs on my playlist, you won't find one.
Nice. Nice.
Last question. I'm gonna turn it over to Kate. Last question.
Damn Wikipedia.
Damn Wikipedia.
So,
he doesn't actually live in Wyoming. He hasn't been married to his wife since 1984. None of that's true.
I do live in Wyoming. I have been married to my wife since you just can't believe everything you read on Wikipedia.
Not true.
You guys got to go to Eric's Instagram page. And
he never wrestled.
Take a look at Eric's photo at what life in Wyoming's like. It's unbelievable, by the way. It looks like you live just so far away from everyone else that you're just remote. No one's near you.
Sounds like heaven, by the way. Sounds awesome.
We've got we do have neighbors. They're quite a ways away. We're on 20 acres and all of our neighbors have large properties. So there are, neighbors around, but we can't watch each other brush each other's teeth in the morning when we go to work. You're not close like you are in the city. But, Wyoming is the size of Colorado and only has about 500,000 people in the whole state. So there's not a lot of people here. There's probably more people in the county you live in than there are in the whole state of Wyoming.
Oh, yeah.
So let me ask you. We have a lot of people on the other end of this that are content creators. They're starting their own Instagram page, but they're really learning how to tell a good story. You're as good as it gets. What makes for a good story?
Well, there's a lot of elements, you got to have a hero. There's got to be a journey. There's got to be a challenge. There's got to be a villain. There's got to be a mentor. It's got to be, the basic elements that are a part of probably every story since cavemen began carving stories on the walls of their caves of animal hunts and heroics, out there trying to kill animals for food and for protection. Those are all stories that started long ago. And if you read anything by Joseph Campbell, the hero's journey, I think, is something that anybody who wants to be an actor or a writer or a producer really needs to read, because to me, it's the essence of storytelling. It's a 3-act structure. You got to have a hero. You've got to have a villain. You've got to have a journey. Those are just basic elements, and almost everything that you watch, read, or entertain by all have various components from that hero's journey.
I love it. All right, Cage, let's get to your rapid fire.
Well, a couple fun ones, right? So I went to law school. I got a son, and if he came to me and said, "Hey, Dad, I want to grow up, and Dad, I want to be just like you, like the cat's in the cradle," right? And he's going to grow up just like me. I tell him, the hell with that. You are not going to law school, my friend. Don't put yourself in that debt. Don't do that to yourself. Go out and have some fun. Do something else. So tell me, your son come to you and tell you he wanted to wrestle? Was it your idea? Is it just kind of a fighting with my family? Is that just one of those things? I mean, people don't realize, I don't think, The Rock's dad was a wrestler, and, it is a very family, oriented business, right? Is that something he came to you and said, "Hey, Dad, I want to do it"?
Yeah, he did. And I was disappointed, to be honest with you, much like you,
Yes.
and like my son had been around, one of the reasons I was able to, I think, keep my family together and happy is that I brought them with me whenever I could. I traveled with my family. When I'd have to go away for 2 weeks on location to shoot TV, I'd bring my kids with me. Wow. If I had to take them out of school, I'd homeschool them during that 2 weeks, or my wife would, because it was.
That's rare, though, right? In what you were doing,
it was important to me. But because of that, my son had been around professional wrestling since he was 4 years old, and then at one point, as he got into his early 20s, he said, "Dad, I want to get into wrestling," and I told him all the reasons, much like you probably would. Because you've experienced that, going to law school and what it takes and what it takes out of you. And I sat down with my son and said, "Man, you don't want to do this." And I'm going to tell you all the reasons why. Starting off with, your last name is Bischoff, which means, yes, you may have some opportunities you might not otherwise have, but the downside of that is there's going to be 5 times more pressure on you than there would be if you just came in off the street. Number one. Number two, half of the people out there in the industry love me and the other half don't. So right out of the chute, half the people in the industry aren't going to like you, and you didn't even do anything wrong.
You got to work 5 times as hard, and you got half as many people who are you can actually impress. Not to mention everybody else is looking at you, saying to yourself, saying the only reason you're here is because of your name.
Yep.
So it makes it even harder.
The other reason was, by the time my son decided he wanted to get into the business, there was really only one place to work. Can you imagine training and going to school for a job and preparing and sacrificing so that you could apply to the only place in the country that was hiring?
Right. Pretty soon that'll happen, by the way. Everyone in college has to realize that they all will be working for Amazon one day. So we're heading that way, Eric. Trust me.
But he did it anyway. You know,
he did it anyway.
He did it anyway. I did my best. You know, I gave him as much guidance and information and perspective as I could. And he decided to do it anyway. And once he made that decision, then I supported him 100%.
Yep. I love it. Yeah, I mean, that's just one of those things in wrestling. I mean, it's all over the place. I mean, I know lawyers who, you know, the father, law firm, the son comes and takes over. And, you know, I've seen it myself. They have to work twice as hard because they are saddled with that name. And, you know, people around them are, you know, hey, you're only here because of that. You got to work twice as hard to get that, you know, the shackles off because of that. But that's pretty cool. And I mean, you know, I open baseball cards with my son. I make it a father-son thing. You have cards where it's you and your son. Like it's got to be cool. You know, you got to look back when you're making your your Ninja Star Wars game, and you're trying to get somebody to, you know, to promote it and sell it for you. And you know, you fast forward. I mean, I guess it's 4 decades or so. And now you got, you know, you're on eBay.
Wow, thanks for that. I needed to feel a little bit older today. So thank you very much for that.
Well, I mean, listen, you know, you look good for your age, and that's cool, man. So speaking of looking good for your age, right? It's a great segue, right? Because my co-host here, he's all about it. He is currently in the middle of Cycle a Deca mixed with some Winstrol. He won't admit it to the audience, but he's doing the old football player stack right now. So you had a recent on your podcast, you had a recent take on professional athletes, wrestlers using steroids. And I mean, currently, obviously the WWF has a policy that they don't allow their people to do it. But you basically came and said, you know, if done correctly, you don't have a problem with it. Am I paraphrasing improperly? Talk to me about your stance on using steroids.
Well, in the context of the conversation I was having that you're referring to, there are legal steroids that doctors prescribe. And by the way, Winstrol V is not one of those.
It's not.
that is a prescription for racehorses.
Yes.
Not for human beings. So you have to kind of delineate, you know,
Andrew's a big guy.
Steroids.
He's a big guy. He can take the whole steroids.
Non-legal steroids. But for example, you know, I'm on testosterone. You know, I'm 65 years old. It's been well documented by scientists and doctors and those who study these types of things, including the FDA, that testosterone is a safe steroid for people who are generally about 35 years old, and as you get older, because as you get older, your body quits producing testosterone at the same level. So by you're in your 20s, you're probably at your peak. In your early 30s, you're starting to not so much. By the time you get to be 40, 50, you're probably average person producing 25 or 30% of the testosterone that you did when you're in your 20s. So supplementing with a prescribed and managed testosterone replacement therapy program, as I do, is a healthy thing. My body is healthier. My joints feel better. There's a lot of benefits to it. Obviously, I'm not a bodybuilder. I haven't been near a gym in a couple of years. So I'm not trying to do it for cosmetic purposes. It's a longevity issue for me. For the same reasons that I eat the way I eat and I take the supplements I take is because, okay, I'm 65 years old. This shit ain't working like it used to unless I help it out. It's no different than having a classic muscle car. You got to feed it premium gas and you got to use the right oil and can't drive it as hard as you used to when it was new, but you could still make it last a long time and at a high level. That's what I'm doing. So I'm a big advocate for legally prescribed, properly managed. And there's the key.
That's the key. Yeah.
My doctor makes me do a blood panel once every 90 days. And in that blood panel, he measures so many different things within my physiology and my blood. You know, the basics, obviously, cholesterol and, you know, my PSA, prostate specific androgens, in case my prostate is getting out of balance, you know, any number of things that he watches. And he adjusts my supplements, not just a testosterone treatment, but all of the supplements that I take according to what I need. And I feel, honestly, and I don't work out. I walk and hike a lot, but I don't lift weights. I don't run out, you know. I feel better now than I've ever felt in my life. Man, maybe that's not true. Probably in my 20s, I felt better, but I'm a firm believer in it. But at the same time, there's a lot of doctors that'll prescribe testosterone that aren't good doctors, that don't manage, that aren't as careful. And there are certainly people that get it off the street that should not be taking it because they don't know what they're taking or if they should be taking it.
All right, makes sense. They made some headlines. Go ahead, Andrew.
Do you guys think that, you know, just like kind of psychedelics and marijuana were taboo, that in 10 years that steroids will no longer be taboo? Like we kind of come around, but it takes a lot longer?
Well, I think, you know, first of all, you got to kind of steroids, you know, we take steroids for asthma, I guess. We take steroids during surgery for inflammation. There's a lot of different steroids out here. I think if you kind of drill down into, you know, performance enhancing drugs / steroids, that's a different category or in a unique category. I'm not sure that performance enhancing drugs, I mean, there's testosterone, there's probably others that I'm not familiar with because I'm not an athlete, that you can get with a prescription. I think for sports, no, I don't think it'll ever be considered appropriate for athletes, professional athletes or amateur athletes to use performance enhancing drugs. It's just not fair. There's no level playing field possible when some can, who have the money and the access, and some can't. It's not right.
What if we could give everyone access? And then, for example, has baseball ever been as exciting as that one summer where they were mashing home runs?
Yeah, but has it ever been more unfair? You know, what about all the guys that were, you know, that had to follow and didn't have the advantage that Mark McGwire had? I don't know. It's debatable. I fall down on the side of it shouldn't happen in professional or amateur sports.
I would love to see if we could push the boundaries of what a human being can accomplish safely. So if we were able to create performance enhancing drugs that don't have a downside, so that we can see, can someone run a 100-yard dash in 8.3 seconds? I think it would be kind of cool.
Well, I mean, to each their own. I don't. I think it would be horrible for sports. What about the athletes that don't have the access or the money, or for physiological reasons are not compatible patients or suitable patients for a certain kind of steroid that somebody else on the team is able to take? It just makes things so unfair and unnatural. You know, I agree with you. There's always a curiosity. Wow, you know, wouldn't it be interesting to find some kid that just wanted to be a super athlete and pump them up full of stuff and say, okay, let's see how fast you can run, how far you can run, how high you can jump, how much weight you can lift. You know, what is the envelope for human performance? Let's do an experiment on you, Jimmy. You want to do it? Let's do it. Yeah, that would be interesting. I'm not so sure it's.
Curiosity is the right word. You captured that really well.
Well,
what else you got for us?
I love it. So how does it feel to have held a WCW championship belt for one day? And by the way, Andrew, I'm going to tell you, he held the hardcore belt for a day and then gave it up, but he's not the shortest holder of the belt.
Who is? I don't even know this. Who is? Carl Ouellet held it for 38 minutes.
Wow. He lost to what's his name? Guy held it for a bunch of time. Norman Smiley, right? They gave it to him, and he immediately had a fight afterwards. It's like someone abdicated it. They gave it to him, and then fought him and lost it 38 minutes later. You gave it to. What's funny about it? Why I remember you beat Terry Funk, but the next day you gave it to a tag team like Big Vito, which is my favorite name, Vito, and you gave it up, and you said both of them were allowed to defend it. was like crazy times. One
They were
person, one
crazy.
belt. You hand it to a tag team and say, you could both defend this belt now. But yeah,
There you go.
that's his belt. He's got the hardcore title belt. Eric Bischoff. He was a champ. You can never have that taken away from you, sir. He was a champ. You gotta love it. Well, listen. So here's the final thing that I'll end it with. Right? Is we have a podcast. You have a podcast. We're gonna tell our folks to go and listen to it. If you haven't already, go check out Eric's podcast. Subscribe to it. Become a listener. Andrew kind of touched on this also about the storytelling, but you've now played many roles in your life. Roles in wrestling, roles at WCW, roles in TNA, roles all over the place, right? And now you're a content creator, right? You were a toy manufacturer for a little while back in the day. You've got all kinds of hats you've worn. And one of the things that binds all of our listeners together here, whether they're wrestling fans or not, is they're almost all hustlers. They're all in this to buy some sports cards and flip them, make some money, have some fun, you name it, right? They're all trying to, make their way in our hobby. They're all trying to, do their thing. A lot of them are content creators as well. So through the different roles you've had there, you got any kind of like Eric Bischoff wisdom to throw on Luca Nation here? One thing, not the elements of the story, but just, is there something you failed once and you got back up? Is there something you can leave our guys with that's just hey guys, remember this one thing, life's gonna kick you in the balls, but the pain's gonna go away. Something.
Well, I mean, I say this to my kids, and I say it to myself, by the way, often, throughout the course of a week or a month, because I'm an entrepreneur. I have been all my life, and one of the things I've learned, I've been blessed with a massive amount of success and a massive amount of failure. I've made some of the best decisions that probably anybody could make in the positions I've been in certain cases. I've also made some of the worst. And what I tell people is don't be afraid to fail. I know we hear that a lot, but failure can mean a lot of things or different things to different people. But for me personally, I recognize when I start shying away from an opportunity or a thought, an idea, if I find myself kind of subconsciously backing away from it, it's because I'm afraid of something. And I always ask myself, what are you afraid of and why? And almost inevitably, it's failure. Even though I'm aware of fear of failure and how powerful it be and how powerful it can be and how inhibiting it can be, it still creeps in because I'm a human being and I have an ego and I have all the things that make us human, but part of those things are sensitivity to failure. But I tell my kids all the time, don't ever be afraid to try, because even if you fail, look at what you learned in that process and bring that with you to the next party. Because eventually that experience from trying and not succeeding or failing, they can be two different things, will give you so much wisdom and will make you so much smarter the next time, that the value, I've learned more from the mistakes I've made than from the successes I've had, believe it or not. The success has been great. And yeah, I love it. And I love all the things that come with it. But it's the mistakes I've made and the failures that I've made in my life that I actually think make me more valuable than the fact that I've had success from time to time.
I love it. Andrew, I can't put a finer point on the episode than that. So go for it.
Luca Nation, let's show Eric what we're about. Where can people find you? Can you give us, 60 seconds, 120 seconds on, what are you up to now? You mentioned you have a Patreon show, 83 Weeks with Eric. Could you let people know where they could find you and what you're up to right now?
Sure. I spend the majority of my content creating time on my podcast, which is called 83 Weeks with Eric Bischoff. You can get it anywhere you get your favorite podcasts. And we focus on, the Monday Night War era of professional wrestling. And it's more, my show in particular is more about the business of the wrestling business than it is about funny stories about what happened on the road. So if you like kind of like the behind the scenes business of the business discussion, I'm your guy. 83 Weeks with Eric Bischoff. I'm also part of a really big and a very successful platform on Patreon called adfreeshows.com. You get about 6 different great podcasts, myself, Jim Ross, Tony Schiavone, Arn Anderson, Kurt Angle's there, Bruce Pritchard, who is currently Vince McMahon's right-hand man in WWE. All of us do our podcasts at adfreeshows.com with no commercials. So you can get them free where you get your podcasts, or you can listen to them at adfreeshows.com. But in addition to that, we pump up a lot of great content. There's animation, there's great interviews, there's all kinds of cool stuff. It's adfreeshows.com over at Patreon. And that's kind of where I spend my time. You can find me on Twitter at eBischoff. And I think I'm over on Instagram, The Real Eric Bischoff or something like that.
Thank you for spending some time with us on another episode of the Lucas, Tigers, and Bronze Oh My podcast. Do us a favor and like, subscribe. You know what? Don't just like and subscribe. Everybody does that. If you like us, tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell your enemies, tell everybody. And we hope you got something from spending some time with us today, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.